The Rebel Capitalist Show.
What should we be prepared for with this whole Klaus World Economic Forum, IMF, global elite narrative? And how can we protect our purchasing power? And how can we actually increase our purchasing power if this globalist agenda actually pans out?
Look, I guess the starting point is this. We've been here before. Like, if you go back and you look through generational cycles of history, you have all these cycles, right? You have your business cycle, roughly 7 to 10 years. You have a credit cycle, roughly 30 years. You have a sort of 85-year cycle, which then often sort of bumps up against a 100-year credit long-term debt cycle. Mm-hmm. So you kind of have all these cycles, and then just keep kind of going around, and they don't necessarily happen globally. They can just happen in one isolation, in one region, or in one country. Certainly the world that 100 years ago, it was more like that. Europe was much more sort of a centralized type of entity, if you will, and a lot of other, like Africa, because you didn't have trade, you didn't have shipping in, the globalization, the sort of connectivity, right, that we have, globalization, right, that we've now experienced post-Bretton Woods, didn't exist. So you had these cycles which still took place, but they took place more in isolation, if you will. But they always take place because human nature doesn't change. And so what we have today is the same thing taking place, but this time it's much more of a connected world that we live in. These cycles, they are both economic, they're social, and they're ideological,
right,
and political. Politics is actually just that psychological, social component, which then affects economic and financial. Okay. And when we look at those cycles, it's fairly evident that not the entire world is caught in the same generational cycle or economic cycle. However, unfortunately for us, much of the Western world is within pretty much the same framework, which actually makes sense. If you go back to Bretton Woods, that was essentially a one world currency system. Largely, it was the dollar-based system, and everybody that was meshed into that, from an economic standpoint, has had a similar experience post-Bretton Woods. Insofar as globalization has affected them all, you can argue whether it's positive or negative, et cetera, but it's not you cannot argue with the fact that it has affected all of those nations that have been tied into that particular system. So from an economic standpoint, it's not, I don't think it's going to change that cycle. Mm-hmm. From a political and sort of social aspect, there are very, very stark differences in some places. And you and I have spoken about this before. And so if you look at some of the countries that have experienced their own cycles that are out of sync with the West. For example, if we look at the former Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc countries, many of those countries experienced these periods of economic stagnation. They experienced communism and so on and so forth, while that wasn't taking place in the West. So there's a bit of a different cycle, and you'll notice it when you like speak. Like, I've got ex-staff that I had a whole team of analysts over in Eastern Europe, and they are all still fairly in touch with East Germany, with what East Germany was, right, because their parents were alive to live, right, it and to experience it.
Yeah, call it central planning. So this cycle is what you're talking about, where they go from central planning, then more to a decentralized free market system, then back to central planning again.
Yeah, and we've gone towards, like, if you think about what made the West great, was freedom of expression, which gives you freedom of productivity, because you can express yourself, you can think about creating new products. It's all about creativity. It's expanding the pie. Mm-hmm. Oh, I think this is great. If I designed this particular thing, it would make my life better. And very importantly, within it, there is a component that has to always be there, which is an ability for you to actually get something out of the work that you put in. If you're not going to, which is the problem with communism,
Private
it's
property
meritocracy.
rights. Right.
You have to have private property rights, and you have to have at least some incentivization scheme for you to actually go out and create something new. You and I might go, oh, well, this is great, we can create that. But if we don't get to keep any of the rewards while we're taking risk in creating that new whatever it is, then it just falls flat on its face. It doesn't make any economic sense or any financial sense or there's no point in taking that risk. So you have to have that component in there. So that was really what began building out of the ashes of World War II, etc. And increasingly that has become socialism. So if you look at government spending as a component of GDP across the Western world, it's just an one-way chart.
Yeah, right.
Okay. And so Karl Marx, bless his cotton socks, was wrong about a lot of things, but he was right about one thing, which is that democracy leads to socialism, and socialism ultimately leads to communism. And we're in that later stage of a blow-off top in socialism, and they're trying to implement communism. And
how do you define those, Chris? How are you defining socialism and communism?
Well, socialism allows a certain amount of productivity to remain with the person that's produced the goods.
Okay, so the state controls the means of production, but yet there are still some private property rights. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. And then the late stages of that are where the communists decide that they need to take over the ownership and the control of those means of production.
And all the property.
And all property.
Right, right. Okay.
So this is no secret now why we see at the World Economic Forum, statements like you will own nothing and you will be happy, and you will have no privacy and you're going to be happy, and so on and so forth. So again, we've been here before. We've seen all of this before. It shouldn't actually be any surprise to anybody that's read some amount of economic and historical literature. Mm-hmm. So, but back to your question, and it's a very good one. In these times, what you ordinarily have, well, what you always have, is a decline in productivity, potentially a collapse, dependent upon how fast that particular transition takes place. With a decline in the productivity, you also have social upheaval, civil strife, and that in itself brings in political instability. So political instability, social instability, and you get revolutions.
Yeah.
And so we're in a revolutionary cycle. It's that simple. So the question, you'd know this better than anybody. The way that we look at things, we look at them from a top-down view. Okay. And we say, okay, well, what are the major trends that are happening? And where is their value? Where isn't their value? This is a period of trying actually to be as safe as you can possibly be. Where can you put capital where it's not going to be at significant risk? The benefit or the bonus actually is that at these peaks and cycles is that the distortions in the market are so egregious that quite often the places of safety are actually also the cheapest, and the places of insecurity are the most expensive. And that's exactly where we're at today. The things that are valued the highest at this point in the cycle are quote unquote growth stocks, as a broad theme. And if we look at them from any metric, whether it's PE ratios, CAPE ratios, price to sales, price to book, whatever, they're expensive. It's impossible to say they're not. You can argue about how expensive they are, and they could get more expensive, whatever. But to suggest that they're at the lows is patently, evidently false. So we know that much. And again, if you go back through periods of history and cycles, you'll see that often manifests itself that way. So we're in a period now where I think it's most important for people to actually don't even try and focus on how you're going to make the most money. The first step is how do you not lose a lot of money? And that's not as easy as one would think, because there's and we'll have clients often saying, "Oh, I'm afraid of the market. I'm scared we're going to have a crash. I'm scared of this. I'm scared of that." And so there's often the judgment call to say, "Well, we're going to just step out of the market." And I always put this back on them and I say, "Well, what exactly is stepping out of the market? Because you're always in the market. If you're stepping out of the market, most people say they're actually just going to dollars, right? They're just going into cash. But cash is a position, right? It's a position itself. And so if you, depending on your time frame, we're not traders. We're trying to look out 5-10 years and say we're trying to position for where we need to be. If I said to you, "George, here's $1 million. Would you be comfortable just in putting this in cash for the next 5 years?" I think most people rationally would look at what's happening at the Federal Reserve and what's happening at the governmental level, and they would say, "Yeah, maybe that's not the smartest move. I'm not quite sure that my $1 million is going to buy me what I needed to buy me in 5 years' time." But back to the trying to answer the question, which is a multifaceted question. From that macro viewpoint, we understand that we're going through this generational cycles we're going through deglobalization now, which is coming at us at warp speed as a consequence of lockdowns.
Right.
And that in itself doesn't just create tensions on a domestic basis. In other words, people losing their jobs or anything else and having difficulties and then trying to deal with those difficulties. It's on an international basis too, because we've created this global system that's so interconnected, right? If we had if what was taking place today took place in the early 1900s, it wouldn't have had anywhere near the ramifications, because global trade was such a tiny percentage of world GDP,
right.
that it would have had an impact. And if we were living in Europe, you might have gone, "Oh, we didn't get our spices from India," or whatever, but you didn't have the same pressures. So we're going through this period not only on a domestic basis, which is a lot of turmoil, but on an international basis. So the question then comes down to, you need to have countries that will have the ability to ideologically stay on some path that is not classed, if you will.
Or Marxist or central planning Marxist,
Yeah.
You're talking about alliances between governments and countries, correct?
But yes. And so when you look at countries, it's important to look at their economic structure, their ideological structure, and also where they're at with respect to these cycles in terms of ideologies and so on and so forth, which is why I mentioned, Eastern Europe and places like that. So if you look at the world like that, and then you look at Klaus's world, where he wants to just implement this massive new world order across global governments, you can see that, again, self-interest is going to bump up against that, because there is an impossibility that all of the facets that Klaus and his Davos crowd want to implement across social, economic, political, all the way down to what food we eat, to implement each and every one of those and have all of these parties around the world be in line with that and have their self-interests mesh with that, it's impossible.
Yeah, the self-interest of the countries, not just the individuals in the countries. So, as an example, one of their big pushes is climate. I don't know what the heck they call it, something different every day, but I guess it's climate change or climate crisis or whatever they're calling it right now. And I'm not here to say that that's good, bad, or the other, but I am here to say that I think the reason they're pushing it has nothing to do with altruism or clean air. I think the reason they're pushing it is because it has to do with being able to control people and to control countries. But what you're saying is, if this is one of their main priorities, you look at the countries who economically would not benefit or economically could be destroyed as a result of this movement, let's say, and then you come to the conclusion that they most likely won't play ball with the global elite, and therefore they will want no part of this little network that they're creating of this Marxist vision.
Absolutely.